Hi, everybody. I am a historian. If you know my writing, you may know my book, Empire of the Summer Moon, which came out about 15 years ago. Thank you. But I also wrote a book about football a few years ago, about a type of passing offense called the air raid that revolutionized the game. But I still am essentially a historian. I write books about the 19th century, about early Texas history, Plains Indians tribes, the Civil War, and even the British Empire. And I don't normally write about football. What attracted me to this particular subject of the air raid, was the possibility of actually writing a history of the forward pass that would cover it from the 19th century forward, but focusing on the 1980s and 1990s, that the game changed. Essentially, it changed from a running game, ground and pound running game, into the thing you've seen on television now, which is a passing dominant game. And it stars the men who made it happen, really a small group of people. I can count them on one hand, one of whom, Hal Mummy, is sitting here tonight. So what I thought I would do tonight is try to tell you why I came to write that book, because it's an interesting story. It's got everything to do with the state of Texas. And I think it kind of explains a lot about why I'm standing here, or we're standing here. So if you lived in Big 12 country in the 2000s, you could not help but notice this crazy type of football that was being played out on the windy plains of West Texas, out in Lubbock area, at Texas Tech University. This oddball coach named Leach, who had a law degree and had never played football, was lighting up the game. They threw the ball all the time. People had never seen this before, 60, 70, 80 times a game. They rarely punted or kicked field goals. Their offensive line was spread from here to Abilene. They were a scoring machine, routinely hanging ungodly numbers of points on some of the best teams in the country. Most years, they led the nation in offense. Their quarterbacks routinely set national passing records. This is every year, too. It wasn't like a year went by when something didn't happen. It did. They pinned 70 points on Nebraska, for the most points in 114 years. So the high point of the 2000s under Mike Leach was a game that took place on November 1st, 2008, between number one ranked Texas with its Heisman candidate quarterback, Colt McCoy, and sixth ranked and undefeated Texas Tech. Now, I won't go through the whole game, but at the end was dramatic as it could possibly be. Colt McCoy had engineered an 11-play, 80-yard drive, nearly perfect drive, to put Texas ahead with a minute and a half to go. The game was over, or it looked like it was over, and then, of course, Tech came back to win in the last seconds of the game, the famous Michael Crabtree catch, which is still the single most important moment in Texas Tech football history. University of Texas fans feel a little bit differently about what happened in that game. And in any case, it wasn't Colt's fault. In the off-season, so after this great year out on the high plains out there, I was kind of sent out to Lubbock to write a story for Texas Monthly about what had happened, and about Leach and his amazing air raid offense. We ended up putting him on the cover with a pirate patch so that anybody who didn't know that he was the pirate at that point then knew that he was the pirate. I wrote a pretty good profile of him, but because of the time and space considerations, I didn't have room to get into where he had gotten this offense, where it had come from, how it worked, because nobody knew how it worked. I mean, nobody knew. People theorized that, Leach had a playbook the size of the New York phone directory. They were actually wrong about that. He had only 5 plays, but no one knew that. Not even the best defensive coordinators in, say, the Big 12, say the Brett Venables of the world, or the Will Muschamps of the world. And the only guy at that point in history who had written a story about Leach of any length was this Michael Lewis, who you may know from The Blind Side, or Moneyball, or The Big Short. But Lewis had also written more or less a profile, hadn't gotten at the issue. The issue was, like, how did they do it? Where did it come from? It was a big mystery. It's why I wrote the book. At one point, I asked Mike where the offense came from, and he said, he started by saying, first I have to tell you a story about a small college in southeastern Iowa with only 500 students, and a coach named Hal Mumme, a name that I had never heard, who had invented this offense at a high school in Texas. And that sounded interesting to me. And I was even more interested when Mike told me a story, just really briefly. He said in the off season that he and Hal would get into an old car and drive through the frozen wastes of the Midwest looking for the secret of the forward pass. And they would talk their way into the Green Bay Packers. They would dig up defunct or unemployed coaches from the defunct Canadian Football League to find some little secret of the pass. This sounded like a sort of a buddy movie to me. It's like these guys are out there inventing reinventing the game. I was hooked. I had to meet this guy Mumme, and that's how my book started. So I want to tell you a few things about Hal. I mean, look, I can't possibly get into. I wrote a book called The Perfect Pass, which is on for sale here today. You may buy a copy, but in that book you will find the full story of exactly where it came from and exactly how it works. And I can't get into that in the time and the space here. But there were a few things that I would like to tell you about. So some great things in football have humble beginnings. The air raid was born first in Texas at that football powerhouse, the University of Texas at El Paso. Graveyard of coaches, which in the years in question was at the absolute bottom of the college rankings. And that may have been why Hal Mumme was allowed to become the youngest offensive coordinator in Division I. Anyway, I wanted to tell you about a game. This is October of 1985 between a winless UTEP, which was actually kind of typical for them, and undefeated national champion BYU. BYU had won 30 of their last 31 games. They were undefeated. They were a 35-point favorite in El Paso. BYU had the greatest passing offense in the country, run by their brilliant coach, Lavelle Edwards. They passed more than anybody, more creatively than anybody, and nobody understood that offense either. Because UTEP and BYU were in the same conference, Hal, as offensive coordinator, had the ability to actually watch a lot of film on BYU, which other coaches elsewhere did not have. He couldn't see their playbooks, but he could reverse engineer them. As I wrote in my book, he was like a man who had found a radio and taken it apart and was trying to figure out how to put it back together again. He studied the game. What happened in that game in October of 1985 shocked the 20,000 people, which is actually not a bad crowd at UTEP, 20,000 people who showed up to see it. UTEP dominated and won the game. I interviewed one of the BYU defensive coaches, and he described to me this miraculous moment when Lavelle Edwards, the BYU head coach, and his staff realized that their own offense that no one understood was being unleashed against them. Hal had basically copied it, without ever seeing a playbook, had copied it brilliantly, had unloaded it on them, and had beaten them with it. Two things now happen, and this is so typical of college football. The first was that Hal and the rest of the staff were fired. The second was that he got a call from the BYU coaching staff inviting him up. Come on up, meet the guys, meet Coach Edwards. We'll show you any film you want to see. Hal took them up on that. And now, sort of chapter 2, all of this knowledge that he'd been accumulating, this experiment he'd been studying the very few people who were passing the ball in the country. It was unleashed in the rolling hills of central Texas at Copperas Cove High School, which is the only job Hal could get coming out of UTEP. It was kind of like this will be a pattern in his life, that the only people who are going to let him do what he wants to do are the people who are in last place. Anyway, it was all unleashed in a really powerful division that had Temple and Georgetown and Westlake and whoever else in there. they had a sensational season by their standards. The ideas worked. Copperas Cove scored more points in their first game under Hal than they had in the entire preceding season. In a 48-minute game, they threw the ball 40 times, unheard of. They beat powerhouse Westlake 53-10. And thus was the air raid invented in the hills of Central Texas and Copperas Cove. What happens next is another implausible turn. Probably the only college in the country that would have let Hal Mumme run this pass crazy offense in a world of ground and pound football. And by the way, the problem, because everybody was running the ball, if you came in and said you were going to throw the ball like every play all the time, one, they'd look at you like you were crazy, but the first time you were intercepted, they'd fire you. So it was not really a winning formula. Anyway, so the school that hires him is Iowa Wesleyan, this tiny little school, traditionally Christian, southeastern Iowa, certifiably the worst college football team in the nation. So we go from UTEP, one of the worst in Division I, to Copperas Cove, which is certainly one of the worst in this part of Texas, and now we're going to the absolutely worst. And now he's being given the ability to run his crazy new offense. He, by an accident of fate or maybe an act of God, Hal hired Mike Leach, one of two candidates for the job. The other one, I think, had a criminal record. I can't remember, but anyway, those two, whose resume included degrees in law and sports science. He had coached the previous summer in Finland, where players smoked cigarettes on the bench. And it was not coincidental that Hal, who knew all about Texas high school football, recruited most of his talent for that team from Texas. So you got a bunch of Texans up in Iowa that are going to reinvent the game of football. Yeah, right. At the worst college in the country. What Mumme and his sorcerer's apprentice, Leach was younger. Leach was the little guy studying. He learned very quickly, by the way. What they did at Iowa Wesleyan was sensational. Almost from the start, they won. Then they won big, and they kept winning, and eventually they won everything they could win. His teams were like nothing anyone had seen. They threw the ball as much as 90 times a game. They didn't have a playbook. His offense was dead simple, but to the defense, it looked like this whirring, high-speed, multi-dimensional machine. If you want to figure out how he did that, read the book. I spent a lot of time looking over Hal's shoulder while he diagrammed and showed me how he did that. While opposing teams ran a heavily ground-oriented game that essentially took place in the middle of the field, they were playing in about half of a football field. It was like ground and pound up the middle, and the linebacker would sit there, and they were used to playing this game, and the linebacker, the butkus dominated, and the halfback would hit the line, and that's where it goes. Hal's game was played full sideline to sideline, full vertical stretches, horizontal stretches. It was balls flying all over the place all the time. They hadn't seen that before. It was like the two teams were playing different games. They rarely punted. They rarely kicked field goals. They hated that. They didn't want anything to do with kicking field goals or punting. And what that meant was that they were also, in addition to playing in a different size field than the opposition, they were playing a 4-down game, and their opponents were playing a 3-down game. Really interesting difference, right? Because if you're playing a 4-down game, your 3rd down isn't where it's supposed to be in the defense's mind, right? What you're going to do is a different thing on 3rd down. You don't have to get a 1st down. Changes the game. They were excuse me. So they were playing a 4-down team, and the other played 3-down. If the other team played as though the main goal in football was to dominate the time of possession, and that was kind of the idea, Hal's team said they just didn't care about it. It made no difference to them at all. They won games possessing it for 20 minutes by 50 points, literally. They didn't care. So it was like he had designed a system where it was going to look hellishly complicated for the defense and incredibly simple for his guys, with all the ground rules changed of what the game of football was about. And that's what they were doing out in this little bitty school in the hills of Iowa. The culmination of this stunning 3-year experiment, which took place, by the way, between 1989 and 1991, was a game against Northeast Missouri State, an awesome Division II powerhouse with 9,000 students, compared to 500 or 600 by that point at Iowa Wesleyan. Northeast Missouri routinely beat Division I schools. And at that game, at that moment when the two clashed, and I think it's fair to say that no team in the history of football, and I mean that literally, going all the way back to Walter Camp at Yale in the 19th century, no team had ever confronted what Northeast Missouri faced that day. It began with the first known attempt in modern football history to play a high-speed, no-huddle offense for the entire game. There were the splits in the offensive line, 5 feet or more. It looked like you could drive a bus through it, but 5 feet between the guard and the tackle. It was strung out across the field. It looked completely insane. Leach perfected it. The quarterback was cleared to change any play he wanted at the line of scrimmage. And unheard of until, we start seeing things like that many years later with people like Peyton Manning. Iowa Wesleyan used the shotgun as a platform for the running game. Nobody doing that. Anyway, it was this entirely different game. It was unleashed for the first time in its entirety, which included the no-huddle, high tempo. Iowa Wesleyan won that game 34-31. They piled up 537 yards of total offense. And as I wrote in my book, this is one of the most important games in American history. It just is, period. I can make that argument all day. No one saw that at the time and still didn't understand what had happened decades later. It was the final unveiling of Hal Mummy's air raid offense with some genius contributions from his assistant. And by the way, the offense that he's running at Iowa Wesleyan in 1991 is almost exactly the offense that Leach ran in that game against Texas in 2008, almost to the T. Anyway, they took this offense to Valdosta State where they set national passing records and lit up the Gulf South Conference. And their success was so stunning at Valdosta that they were hired at Kentucky, which was one of the worst teams in the SEC. Now you start to see a pattern here, right? Almost every step that Hal goes, he's starting at the bottom. And the argument is, and I think he feels this way, is you're only going to be allowed to do that if you're at a team that can only go in one direction, that being up. On October 4th, 1997, at their home stadium in Lexington, Mummy, Leach, and their air raid offense at the University of Kentucky beat Alabama for the first time in 75 years. As one sports writer put it for ESPN, by the way, Dave, that was the year the whole world heard about the air raid, finally. That was the year that everything they'd been doing since Copperas Cove, or Hal had been doing since Copperas Cove, paid off. The world found out about it. And the quote, and I quote from ESPN, "It was Hal Mummy who brought you the game you are watching today. He was the one who brought video game offenses to the SEC, and it was there that football changed forever." Thank you very much.